Good afternoon, everyone. For those that I haven't met yet, I'm Aisling O'Carroll, and I work in our International Financial Services Division based in Dublin. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome Caroline Farberger as a speaker at our conference today. Caroline has more than 30 years' experience in leadership positions in the financial services industry in Sweden, including 6 years as CEO of ICA Insurance, which grew under her direction from an upstart provider to one of the fastest growing consumer insurers in Sweden. Caroline is the first senior business leader in the Nordics to speak openly about her gender transition, having formerly lived as Carl Farberger. Consequently, she has become an advocate and ambassador for diversity and inclusive leadership. Today, Caroline will be in conversation with Rachel Shelly, who is IDA's Medical Technologies Department Manager and also leads the gender pillar in IDA's EDI team. I first heard Caroline speak at an asset management conference in Dublin this autumn. Attending that conference, I expected to learn a bit more about crypto assets or the rise of alternative funds. But I didn't expect to find myself questioning my own internal biases. I hope that you will all find this conversation as interesting and insightful as I did. Thank you.
Thanks, Aisling. Caroline, you're very welcome to IDA Ireland's annual conference. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today and have you share your personal journey and perspective around equality, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Caroline, you've lived 50 years as a highly successful male, with climbing to the ranks of CEO within ICA Insurance, raising a family and seemingly having it all. What was the turning point for you starting your transition journey?
Well, already in my childhood, I felt that something was different. I grew up as a boy, as any normative boy you could think of, but I had this strange affection for femininity. But back then, I was born in 1967, there was no place to discuss that. And so I felt ashamed and I felt the guilt and I promised myself never to tell anything about it. Fast forward, here you see me at 50 years of age, which was 5 years ago. I seemingly had it all. I was a successful CEO of a fast-growing insurance company. I did what you could expect of a CEO, namely delivering solid quarterly reports with ever-increasing results. I had the perfect normative background, dual university degrees in engineering and finance, having spent the first 6 years of my career as management consultant with McKinsey, and then risen through the ranks of the insurance business in Sweden's arm of Royal Sun Alliance. Why? 3 kids, nice stately home, nice company, car, even master of ceremonies in the local Freemason lodge. I fulfilled seemingly all normative requirements you could think of as a CEO in finance, including the right shade of grey in the suit and the right amount of grey color in my hair. But at the same time, I felt that I could not withstand it any longer. Those things that have grown inside me, that feeling that I simply did not fit in this role. There was something about that femininity that didn't want to go away, but I was extremely afraid because what would happen if I gave way to this? How would society treat me? Would I be ridiculed? Would I even lose my position in business society? Could a trans person be CEO of an insurance company? It had never happened before, as far as I knew. So I was very scared of being excluded. At the same time, I just knew that I've only one life to live. So I just need to give it a shot, to live my life as who I am, as a woman. And that was the start of my transition journey, literally a journey of my life. but it turned out extremely well, thanks to the support of my family, thanks to the support of my employer and everyone around me. It's a true success story.
Absolutely. And Caroline, how has your perspective changed regarding equality in the workplace and the female experience, since your transition?
Yeah, well, I genuinely thought that the only thing that would change was my packaging, which is me to the right on this picture here, and things would progress as before. But then people immediately what happened was that people asked me, will you now have a feminine leadership style? And I asked people, why do you ask that? I mean, my leadership style is a product of my experiences and values, and those haven't changed, at least not initially. But people kept asking me, will you now express female leadership? And then I realized how much expectations you put on a person depending on which package that person comes from. So if you all, for a moment, let's assume that the person to the left, the man, is presented as your new boss. You haven't heard him before, you just see the picture of him. Imagine yourself, what expectations do you have of his leadership style? How well do you relate to him, and how well would you respect him as your leader? Then do the same example with the woman to the right. Assume that is your new boss. What would you expect of her leadership style? How well would you relate to her? How well would you respect her as your leader? Now, the obvious question is, do you come to exactly the same conclusions, or do you have differences in feelings? And of course, you all have differences in feelings and expectations, because that's how we as human beings are wired. And those differences is the very definition of your unconscious bias, which we all have, which I have. But the true thing that happened that maybe changed perspectives is how I was treated differently by the women around me, because they included me as one of them and told me all those stories that had never told me before, how difficult it was to withstand the tough jargon, how difficult it was to hear those jokes that were not at all funny, how difficult it was to make your voice heard in meetings or to influence decisions that seemingly had been made beforehand outside of meetings by some men, or how difficult it was to make a career in finance. And even I got testimony of sexual harassment from people that I worked closely with. And I asked the women, why didn't you tell me these stories before? And they were like, don't you see you were a man? Why didn't you wouldn't have understood if I've told you back then. And then I realized that I hadn't seen the complete picture. There was so much I had missed in my life as a man. And I now realize that if you've invited me 5 years ago talking upon this subject of gender norms, I would have done so with great confidence, like I was presenting a quarterly report with great confidence. But I now realize that I hadn't understood it at all. There was so much I had missed that I'm so grateful that I've understood now from other women around me.
Caroline, is there anything that you've changed or done since your transition that you might never have considered doing previously?
Yeah, well, that is how I've been much more mindful in including other people around me. Because now that I've realized that people belonging to different categories than myself, in my previous role as a white heterosexual man, that would be women, people of color, people with functional variations or disabilities, etc. I thought I was inclusive, but I now realize I really wasn't. So I have one example. For example, this is a picture which I've taken myself from an annual gala in Sweden to celebrate entrepreneurship. It's the most prestigious gala that's held every year, where you deliver great prizes. 1,000 people attend that event, and I got 2 VIP tickets. And my obvious question to myself, who would I bring? In my old life as a man, I would have thought of, okay, which business associate should I bring which could benefit me, maybe my boss to impress on him, or a business associate so that that person would owe me a favor. That is, how would I use my invitation to benefit myself? But then with my new perspective, I thought, okay, but this is a prestigious event, and it's a privilege to be invited here. Who would benefit from being here, but is not invited? And I thought that, well, I'm not very networked in the communities outside my own community, but this is typically a very normative event, a very white event, pretty much a male event also, and pretty much an event for people who are established in the business community. So I set out a task to find someone through networking who was very much on the other end of that scale. So through networking, by recommendation, I got my date for that evening, which was a woman called Aisha Jones. She is a young single mother of 3. She's an immigrant from Gambia, a Muslim, and she lives in a low-income suburb of Stockholm. She was an aspiring entrepreneur. She wanted to have her own makeup company, but she didn't have any networks. And most of all, she didn't know how to acquire capital, given her background. So I took it as my task that evening to see how could I share my networks and introduce her to them so that she would be funded, because she had all the intrinsics, but she was disadvantaged. And well, the rest is history. I introduced her to my networks, and it became a great success. She actually did require capital from the Swedish State Investment Agency, and that was very well received in the media coverage, which you will see on the next slide. The left is a media coverage about that success story, how the contacts that were made that evening enabled her to get her funding to become a makeup company CEO, which is now a very promising company. And she and I was actually invited to a television talk show on last March 8, which is the National Women's Day, where we talked about how women could help one another, how we could work cross borders, how we can invite people not belonging to our own category. Because the intrinsics is there, the entrepreneurship potential is there.
That's a terrific story about, making a real impact in a really meaningful way by just countering that, segregation that exists, from a business perspective, be it through socioeconomic diversity or indeed, because of people's backgrounds or indeed the color of their skin. So, taking that, walking the walk and taking that approach to really bringing people to that party, bringing people to that conversation and engaging them really proactively through your network really is having such a meaningful impact, so it's terrific. In what other ways has coming out publicly as trans benefited others, do you think, Caroline?
Well, it's basically the power of representation. Because what held me back when I was 5 years ago, should I do a transition or should I not, was that I had not seen anyone at a senior business position coming out as trans. So I didn't think it was possible. Therefore, I wasn't sure whether I would do it or not. But taking the plunge in coming out and just being in that position and choosing to be visible in media on that position, I know has helped others. I've received numerous mails and other contacts from people who are simply happy that I have chosen to do this publicly, because then they can feel that, well, I've also a chance of becoming a senior business leader if I want to, despite being trans or despite being in another category on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And even more importantly, or to my heart, is messages from parents which may be worried that they have children coming out as trans and being worried that they won't have chances to have a career. So people belonging to a underrepresented category, the more visible they are, the better it is for others.
So moving into the workplace then, what did your employer do to create an environment that felt safe for you to be your authentic self? And did you encounter any challenges along the way as you came out?
Well, this is actually the pictures I want to emphasize this with is actually my coming out day. The picture to the left is how I left work as a CEO of the insurance company on a Thursday afternoon at 5 p.m. The picture to the right is how I came back to office the very next morning, Friday morning at 8 a.m. That is my day of transition. So I really did it overnight. It was a big event. My management team had received a week notice and my employees 1 day notice to make it a sort of a big event. And the one thing that made me feel comfortable to come out to my employer, which I've done 5 months prior to this day to enable them to prepare for this big event, was that they had already beforehand celebrated diversity. ICA is the biggest grocery retail chain in Sweden, to which my subsidiary reported. And they've had many stories of people being LGBTQ plus in the big organization. And those were celebrated. So I felt that I would probably be loved if I came out as trans, since many other diverse people are being loved. So just by demonstrating it, especially those senior business leaders who belong to the norm, typically white, male, heterosexuals, the more they engage themselves, the better it is for us who belong to other categories. And yes, it was a huge success. I've not received one single negative comment, neither in face nor in mail or on social media. It became a 100% success. I'm very, very grateful to everyone around me.
That's fantastic. And as you say, it's the environment and the culture that exists within the organisation and how the organisation takes a proactive approach towards inclusion and towards diversity and equality. I think that sets I suppose the context for people to feel comfortable to come forward and be themselves. And it's so important that we stay true to that. So from a practical perspective then, how can other managers and leaders, what can they do to create a more equal and inclusive environment for everyone in the workplace?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And I started to reflect myself when I've lived as a woman for 2 or 3 years. How did I really handle this as a man? And I realized I wasn't very conscious about these issues. I sort of just stumbled on in life and took all the societal structures for granted. For example, the one thing that actually plays a very big role is networking. Who did I network with? I mean, we all have networks like it. If you all think about which people would you list as someone belonging to one of your networks, you would typically come up with a quite long list of people that have crossed your paths previously in life. And I did so myself. I looked through my photo album and saw what networks do I have. I mean, starting upper left corner, my platoon in my military service. People I spent literally days in the trenches with, and people I spent time with in the cadet school. We have strong memories together. Upper right corners, those were the days when I was a finance consultant with McKinsey and Company. We felt that they almost ruled the world, advising the top CEOs in finance. Bottom left corner, which is actually a picture from an executive team activity from an insurance company I was a part of. At that particular year, we had actually 0 women in the executive team, which had the benefit of not having to compromise on choice of a team activity, hence the hunting trip. Haha.
We haven't started doing those yet. Maybe next year.
Bottom right corner, the Freemason Lodge, where I was Master of Ceremonies. I mean, these were just examples of my networks. I didn't reflect much upon them. I thought, everyone has networks. This is just the way life is. Looking at these networks in the eyes of a woman, I kind of realized, where are the women? There were none. Where are people of color? There were none. And as far as I know, everyone I networked with was a heterosexual. So then I started to realize is what kind of a white male bubble have I lived in? And then I maybe thought the experiment of what would happen if I would pitch in a woman in any of these settings. Would she have felt comfortable? Probably not, because I remember the jargon. I remember the jokes that were made, jokes that were laughed at, jokes that I laughed at. Not because they were funny, but just that was the culture. Then I realized what an exclusive culture I've belonged to. And I've been a culprit in upholding quite sort of non-progressive norms. But then I thought maybe women also have these kind of networks. But no, I've not yet encountered any woman who can show a similar set of networks. Then I realized what a privilege this has been. This is a picture of privilege. Because how does it work when I, as a senior CEO, want to recruit someone to an important position in my management team, or if I, as a board chairman, want to recruit another board director? Yes, I would know that I'm supposed to have a diverse recruiting approach and go through certain procedures to make it look good, like I'm considering by a diverse set of candidates. But in my reptile brain, my mind goes, well, this is an important position. I really need to recruit someone that I trust. And who do I trust? Well, there's someone I have a common history with, someone which I know will actually be sufficiently strong. So my reptile brain would unconsciously go to the pictures, the people in my networks, the people I'm looking at right now. So I'm not as surprised any longer why we have not come further in terms of diversity on senior business levels in our society, because these networks that I've been a part of is actually a self-reinforcing structure where we unconsciously pick people to join our management teams and boards that we have a shared history with. So that's something that I promised myself, to go out of my way of recruiting people who are definitely not part of my past, so that I can open the doors for the rest of the society, because the society is actually more colorful and diverse than it was when I was a child.
Absolutely, and I think the key piece with all of this is around, living authentically, and you talk passionately about authentic leadership. And again, pushing yourself to challenge your own biases and really challenge yourself to open yourself up to all of these wonderful experiences that we can tap into and learn from, within our networks and our ecosystems and our communities and indeed our workplaces. So how does being true to yourself make you a better leader? You might just tell us what that looks like and how that impacts on other people.
Yeah, well, being true to oneself is actually allowing yourself to be a human being as opposed to a model. I now realize, since I've left my male persona, that the macho norm was actually something that that allowed myself to not showing who I am. For example, almost 20 years ago, when my wife and I first started to have children, we had actually great difficulties, and we went through a lot of in vitro fertilization attempts, and that was very hard for both of us. And I said to myself, well, this is a personal issue, so I will not show this personal thing to my colleagues, because I'm a professional. I'm supposed to just be a business person at work. So I didn't tell anyone at work what my wife and I were going through. But after a while, my senior manager called me into his office and said to me that, well, you know, you've been treating people quite badly recently. Is something going on in your life? And then I realized that I had not been able to hold things back. In holding myself back, I let it go out over my behaviors. So I gave my full story, and I had to go the full round of explaining myself to people around me whom I have treated badly. And from that day forward, I promised myself to always be transparent as a human being. If something goes on in my private life that affects the way I am and think, I invite people to listen to me, because I am a human being. And, and at the same time, whenever I meet a new colleague, I go to great lengths to get to know that person as a human being, as opposed to just a Lego brick in the company structure, as someone who just performs a set of tasks. Because ultimately, we are human beings. And my imagination of macho norms, you know, projecting strength, not showing feelings, be uber professional in every conceivable aspect, wasn't making me an interesting leader. That made me a character, but not a human being. So bring your whole self to work. Get to know your colleagues personally. Be genuinely interested in people who are not like yourself, people with a diverse background or belonging to a different category. And task yourself to educate yourself and learn from others. And you will be seen, and you will be having much more rewarding relationships with colleagues around you. And in the end, you will be a much more successful leader. Because leadership nowadays is not about managing tasks as much. It is about managing people. And you only do that by having engaging relationships with people around you.
Absolutely, and I think this is a big piece as well, as around, you know, we're not just employees, we're individuals, but we're also members of communities, we're members of networks. And I suppose when we look at the wider societal piece, you know, Scandinavia has always had a great global reputation for social progress and equality. But as we've seen last year in Oslo, you know, with the horrific attacks on the LGBTQ plus community there, it's a painful reminder that we still have a long way to go. So for policymakers and leaders here in the room, you know, what has Scandinavia done well that we can learn from a workplace perspective? But what do we all need to do collectively to build and reinforce cultures in that are inclusive and respectful in our wider societies? Just interested in your thoughts on that. Just as individuals, when we leave the workplace, you know, where we may have EDI policies and we've a lot of different norms that we need to, and behaviours that we need to display in the workplace, when we walk out of the workplace, how can we ensure that we keep that, you know, core element around that respect and inclusive in the wider communities we're all involved in?
Yeah, well, the one thing that you should think of is that the responsibility to build an inclusive society rests with all of us, especially if you belong to the norm. Because previously in my life as a white heterosexual man, I kind of had the feeling, and now realize that I thought, well, that is the role of the legislators, and then we can subsidize organizations that cater specifically for people belonging to different categories, let it be immigrants or LGBTQ plus or people with disabilities, whereas I could just walk on in my life and not engage myself. Inclusion is the responsibility of everyone, especially if you belong to the norm. Because if you belong to the norm, even though I'm a trans person, which is non-normative, I'm still white, which is a privilege in itself, then I have a responsibility of being inclusive to others. If I see someone being bullied, or I hear someone being bullied, I have a responsibility to actually uphold my standards of what is acceptable or not in the society. So it is our responsibility as citizens to build our society, because we can easily fall back. It's easy to see it. I mean, there are countries not very far from us where I would not be comfortable traveling, depending on the local culture. And we cannot sort of think that we come this far and we're satisfied ourselves. Being inclusive, being respectful to people who are different and look different is something that needs to be worked on every day.
Absolutely, and I think there's one element of that is the respectfulness piece, and I think the other piece is the allyship, the stepping up piece. You might just talk to us a little bit about what that looks like and what that means to you.
Yeah, well, allyship is actually, I've changed mindset around that, because previously in my life, I thought it was, being kind to people who look differently. Like, okay, I can mentor this young person, and then I've done my things. Well, being an ally, which is especially important if you belong to the norm, because then you're privileged, is about engaging yourself to remove the structural barriers that exist in most organizations. Structural barriers could be that there are differences in pay grade, in pay, depending on gender or other categories, or that it's more difficult to advance in your organization if you're an immigrant or have a disability. You should set out to understand what is the unconscious bias you and others have, what are the barriers that exist in your organization, and then set out to change them, and to help and advance everyone not belonging to your own category. So it's understanding, it's not about helping individuals, it's about leveling the playing field. Because I now realize that as a white heterosexual man, I was playing a home game in the finance sector in Sweden, whereas many women and people of color actually playing an away game. Is that it's always a bit more difficult, and whereas I had the home turf advantage. So leveling the playing field, and set out to understand what is more difficult if you would belong to a different category. Understand those barriers and remove them.
Absolutely. As a parent, I think, and one of a parent of an 11-year-old daughter, I'm a big believer in the whole concept of if you can see it, you can be it, and that's from all aspects of life, from sport, career, all of the different elements. You've talked about role models and representation, and it's very clear that you and a very small but thankfully growing number of LGBTQ plus CEOs are real game changers, both within your sectors and within the corporate world. As such a powerful role model for others, I'm really interested to know, where do you draw your own inspiration from? Who are your role models? And people that you really get your strength from, and people that we potentially can learn from and look up to?
Well, that's a really good question. Also, previously in life, I was in sort of the CEO treadmill, and my dream was to become an even more important CEO. So it would be like being. When I was a kid, it was like being Jack Welch or some other famous CEO. That has changed. My role models are iconic people like Mandela and Gandhi and others, because they were self-sacrificing in creating a society that would be better for everyone, not putting themselves in the center. And I take that as inspiration of working or spending time to actually removing barriers in the society around me to include others. For example, the example of bringing an underrepresented immigrant founder to a gala. I set aside quite a lion's share of my time seeing how I could be more inclusive and remove barriers in my society, as opposed to what is the next step in my own career? How could I advance my own career for the sole benefit of me and my family's financial wealth? But rather, how could I be a contributor to a more inclusive society? That is what inspires me.
Caroline, in terms of advice for people that might be on a similar journey, or indeed might have family members, children, friends who are on a similar pathway to the journey that you've been through, what advice would you give to them, and indeed the friends and family members and colleagues that surround them and become part of that support network? Because as you talked about at the beginning, it's such a huge change. There's so many different things to take into consideration, so many fears to overcome. So how can we be really practically supportive to people in our personal and in our professional environments?
Well, thanks for asking the question. And the one thing you could think of is be accommodating. Do not shy away and think, oh, I don't know how to handle this, or better stay away. Because when people are in their coming out process in an LGBTQ plus context, they are extremely vulnerable. And many of them are thinking that they will realistically lose many relationships during that process, and many unfortunately also do. But be accommodating. Demonstrate that you will support them. Acknowledge that you might not understand all aspects of it, because I understand that being transgender could be a bit difficult to comprehend from a practical point of view, like how does it really work, and how sure can you be, and what does it mean, etc. Never mind that you might not, or maybe never, understand the full aspects of it, but demonstrate your commitment to support this person, because you are very lonely in such a process, and you are in need of people who are supportive, people who are respectful, people who want to listen to you. So if you have a friend, say that, well, I'm happy to learn more about this, and whatever it entails, I will support you. And as a parent, I can understand that you might be fearful. I mean, will my child now get bullied, or will my child now not have a good career? Please support that child. Let that child experiment with gender expressions. Demonstrate unconditional love.
Absolutely. We're coming close to the end of our time together. When we spoke last, you talked about inclusion driving business value, and
Yes.
that this whole piece around EDI, this isn't a female issue, a male issue, it's an issue for all, and we're all beings of equal worth. When will we get to a point when this is the new normal, when having a transgender CEO of a highly successful business is not a thing? Are we going to, do you see that coming anytime soon? And is there anything else that we should be thinking about to help us get to that journey quicker?
Well, great. I hope that we will come to a day to just shrug our shoulders when we talk about the transgender CEO. I would love us to embrace variation as part of being normal. I now admit that in my old days, I unconsciously favored people who were like myself, who reasoned like myself, who looked like myself, because socially I had an easier time interacting with them. And someone who was different, maybe didn't even speak Swedish, but just English, was somewhat difficult, and I shied away from it unconsciously. I'm now embracing diversity, and I'm celebrating it because I know that diversity enhances business value in the company. Because the more homogeneous you are in a leadership team or a board or an organization, the less likely you are to be relevant in the future. So by harnessing the diversity which we already have in society, and let it influence your organization, even at senior levels, we will be much more equipped to meet the challenges of tomorrow.
Caroline, thank you so much for that. It's been an absolute privilege to talk to you today, and thank you for sharing so honestly your journey and all of the insights that you've gained with us. I think it's so important for us all to take all of the feedback that you gave us today on board and really think about how we think about bias, how we act within our work environments, and how we act within our communities. Because to your point, I think there's huge value in inclusion, and we all have the potential to really change the world if we work together and respect each other and all of our differences, because that's where the beauty comes. So thank you, Caroline, so much for being with us today, and I'll hope the team will join me in giving a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.